Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're going to be tackling a huge topic, global systems of governance. We're going to be looking at how societies throughout history and, well, all around the world have organized themselves. But trust me, this isn't your typical history lesson.
That's right. We tend to get stuck looking at history through, just a Western lens, but it's so much more diverse than that. What we'll be talking about today are those societal and economic structures that really make us question everything and give us some fresh perspectives on how we view the world, even today.
Exactly. So get ready, because we're going on a journey that will take us everywhere. From the economies of indigenous tribes to the feudal systems in Japan and China, the rise and fall of empires built on trade, and even socialist revolutions far beyond Europe.
By exploring these diverse examples, I think we can really gain a much deeper understanding of how power and resources and social structures have all worked together throughout history to make the world what it is today.
Okay, so let's jump into it. Starting at the very beginning. How did early humans, before civilizations, how did they live together and share resources, make decisions?
It's fascinating to think about. Just imagine small groups of hunter-gatherers or early agrarian communities working together without the complex hierarchies we see later on. They had to find ways to manage their resources, resolve disputes, ensure their survival. And honestly, they often did it remarkably well, with a really strong sense of community, too.
It makes you think about how cooperation and community were essential for survival, way before any kings or empires even existed. Are there any, specific examples that come to mind?
Definitely. Take the Zulu in Africa. They created a complex system of social organization and military strategy that helped them build a very powerful kingdom. Or the indigenous tribes in North America. Many had systems of communal ownership and sustainable practices, and decision-making processes that were really focused on consensus and well-being for everyone.
It's so interesting how these early societies were, in a lot of ways, quite progressive, especially nowadays. Sharing, sustainability, collective decision-making. But things changed at some point, right? Like that's when empires and hierarchies and, well, power all came into play.
Yeah, as those societies grew and technology started to advance, we saw the very first empires popping up. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, this was a huge shift in how humans organized themselves. Power went right to the kings, the pharaohs, the emperors. They controlled all the land, resources, and people.
So was that the start of the bad old days,
Yeah.
with all the oppression and inequality? Was that empire's inevitable downfall?
Well, no, not quite. I mean, it's true that those empires brought in social hierarchy and control, but they also created some amazing innovations. Just think, writing systems, monumental architecture, really complex systems for irrigation and agriculture. Those things wouldn't have been possible without that centralized power.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword, I guess. On the one hand, a lot of power, a potential for exploitation. But on the other, advancements that benefit everyone. It's like that tension between power and progress is always there, isn't it, throughout history?
Exactly. And as we keep going, we're going to see that tension, that back and forth across different cultures and, well, different continents. But before we do that, let's take a closer look at how those empires actually worked. Like, how did they manage their economies? How did they collect taxes, keep order over all that land?
That's a great question. I'm really interested to hear about some of the empires we don't usually learn about, in school.
Well, get ready to expand your knowledge then, because we're going beyond the typical Greece and Rome. We're talking empires that spread across massive distances. The Mongol Empire, stretching from Asia to Europe, or the Mughal Empire in India, incredible administration, flourishing arts.
I'm picturing all the incredible palaces and art, but their economies. Was it all conquest and just taking things, or was there something more to it?
Well, yeah, conquest definitely played a role in how empires grew. But to really survive, empires needed more than just brute force. They needed ways to manage their economies, collect taxes, make sure things were moving and being traded across their territories.
So what did those systems look like? The Mughals, for example.
Yeah.
How did they uh, balance their rule with governing everyone and managing such complex economies?
Well, they kind of blended centralized rule with what we might call feudalism. They granted land and authority to regional governors, but in exchange for loyalty and taxes. That let them keep control while also giving some power back to local leaders.
Feudalism, isn't that like a medieval Europe thing? With knights and castles, I had no idea it was a thing in other places.
It's true, we often think about Europe, but feudalism in different forms, of course, it existed in many cultures. Like, take Japan. Their feudal period with the shogun and the samurai lasted for centuries, and it had its own very unique economic and social structures. We'll talk more about that later.
This is already really interesting. It really shows uh, how limiting it is to only focus on Europe. It's like we're missing a whole world of history and totally different ways of organizing societies.
Exactly. And this is just the beginning. Wait till we get to the economics of the Islamic Golden Age or ancient India and China. That's where things get really interesting. But before that, let's take a second to think about what we've talked about. What are your first impressions of these early societies and empires?
I think what's hitting me the most is just how many different ways there are to approach governance and economics. It really shows there's no one right way to run a society. People have been trying different things for, well, thousands of years. I'm so curious to hear what other examples we'll be talking about as we continue our deep dive.
You'll be amazed. Trust me. So, are you ready for some more eye-opening information? Ready to explore some truly groundbreaking economic innovations?
Absolutely. Hit me with it. I'm ready. All right, so we've covered empires and feudalism.
Yeah.
What about some really unique economic systems? What else is there?
Well, let's go to the Islamic Golden Age. It's known for a lot of things, advancements in science and philosophy and art, but what most people don't realize is that it was a time of just amazing economic innovation.
Really? I have to admit, I don't know that much about Islamic history. Tell me more about those advancements.
Imagine a world with trade networks spanning, huge distances, connecting east and west. It was a vibrant exchange of goods and knowledge and culture. This was the Islamic Golden Age, and they didn't just trade, they really shaped it.
That's amazing. But what made their system so different? Were there any specific practices that made them unique?
Oh, absolutely. One of the key innovations was, well, it was the development of some really sophisticated financial tools and institutions.
Yeah.
Like the Beit al-Mal, a public treasury that managed finances and actually provided social welfare services, was kind of a precursor to modern public finance systems, and even social safety nets.
Social welfare back then, that's pretty progressive, especially for that time period.
Exactly. They were ahead of their time in a lot of ways. Another really interesting part of their system was, well, Islamic finance, which is all about ethical investing and risk sharing. They had institutions that made trade easier, provided credit, managed investments, all while, following those Islamic prohibitions on interest.
Okay, so how do they manage finances without using interest? That seems like a pretty big limitation.
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of why Islamic finance was so innovative. So instead of interest, they created systems of profit and loss sharing. So investors and entrepreneurs shared the risks and the rewards, and that meant that wealth was distributed more fairly. And they also encouraged investment in, well, socially responsible projects. They even had early bonds called sukuk. They followed those Islamic principles, and investors got returns based on, well, on how well the assets were doing.
Wow. That's really something. It really challenges the idea that that complex financial systems were a Western thing.
Yeah, definitely. The Islamic world was a major player in the global economy for centuries, and their innovations had a huge impact
Yeah.
on trade, finance, and even social welfare.
This is really amazing. It makes you wonder why we don't learn more about these, incredible achievements in history class.
It's partly because I think we tend to focus on a very small part of history, usually centered around, well, Europe and the West. But when we open our minds and look at other cultures and civilizations, there are so many fascinating stories and groundbreaking innovations.
You're right. It's like we're uncovering a whole secret history of economic thought.
Yeah, exactly. And as we keep going, you'll see just how connected the world really was, even centuries ago. Now, are you ready to travel east? Explore ancient India.
For sure. India has always been so fascinating to me. It's got such a rich history. What about their economic systems?
One of the most distinctive features of ancient India was the caste system. This hierarchical system determined a person's occupation, their social standing, even their access to resources just based on when they were born.
I know the caste system is a sensitive topic, and we often associate it with with inequality and discrimination. How did that actually work when it came to the economy?
It was completely intertwined. It dictated what work people could do, the goods and services they could provide, and the wealth and status they could achieve. So, for example, the Brahmin caste, they were usually priests and scholars and teachers, while while the Kshatriya caste were the warriors and rulers. Merchants and traders were Vaishya, and those who did manual labor, they were Shudra.
So it wasn't just like a social hierarchy. It was a whole economic system determining people's jobs and opportunities.
Yes, exactly. And it really impacted how wealth and power were distributed. But beyond the caste system, there are other really interesting parts of their economy too.
Oh, like what?
Well, think about temples. We usually think of temples as, as religious centers, but in ancient India, they were also major economic players.
Really? I never heard that before. Tell me more.
Temples owned a lot of land. They employed a lot of people. They were involved in all sorts of economic activities, like agriculture and trade, even banking. They were often the wealthiest places in their communities. They really shaped the economy.
This is incredible. It's like a whole other side of ancient India that I had no clue existed.
Yeah.
It really makes you think that that the way we look at history is really incomplete.
It definitely is. There are so many stories, so many different ways of seeing the world, and as we continue, you'll see just how diverse and interconnected human societies have been throughout history.
I'm excited to hear more. But for now, let's switch gears and talk about another ancient civilization, China.
China, a land of dynasties and innovations. What are you most interested in when it comes to China's economic history?
Well, I've always been fascinated by the Chinese dynasties, but I have to say I get them all mixed up. Could you give me a quick overview of the major ones and how their economic systems were different?
Of course. China's history is marked by, well, all these dynasties, each with their own way of governing and managing the economy. Some of the biggest ones are the Tang, the Song, the Yuan, and the Ming.
I've heard of them, but I'd love to know more about their specific policies. What made them stand out?
Okay, so the Tang dynasty, they were known for trade, lots of it, along the Silk Road. And they implemented policies that really encouraged commerce and developed their infrastructure. And they also encouraged cultural exchange. So their economy really thrived. And that led to this golden age of art and literature and technology.
The Silk Road, it's legendary. It's incredible to think about all the trade and the cultural exchange that happened over, such huge distances. But what about the other dynasties? How did their economies compare to the Tang dynasty?
Well, the Song dynasty, which came after, shifted toward a more centralized state, more bureaucracy. They did some interesting things with finance, like using paper money. They invested heavily in things like canals and irrigation, and they also focused on agricultural production, and they had state monopolies on certain industries, salt and tea, for example.
So a bit more government control than the Tang.
Yes. And this continued with the Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan and the Mongols. They had a really centralized administration, standardized weights and measures, and they also promoted trade across their vast empire.
The Mongols. I always think of them as warriors. I never really thought about their economic policies.
It's interesting. Right? We usually associate them with conquest, but they were also very good administrators, and they were very pragmatic. They understood that trade and a stable economy were important. And then we have the Ming Dynasty. This marked the return of, well, native Chinese rule, and they focused on policies that encouraged agricultural production, and they brought back the civil service exam system, and they also started these huge maritime expeditions that extended China's influence all across the Indian Ocean.
Wow. So much history, so many different ways to manage an economy. It's really amazing to see how each dynasty left its mark on China.
It really is, and it highlights a key theme we've been talking about. How societies throughout history have, well, struggled with organizing labor, managing resources, creating systems that shape their economies.
It makes me wonder, did any of these societies ever try systems that were, I don't know, maybe less hierarchical, more focused on equality, where everyone benefits, not just the elite?
That's a really good question. And it leads us right into our next topic, the rise of socialism, but not in the West. This is about how those socialist ideas took root in totally different places around the globe.
Okay, now you got me really intrigued. Socialism outside of Europe. This is where it gets really interesting. So we're talking about socialism, but not the European kind. This is about how those ideas, socialist ideas, how they spread to other parts of the world.
Yeah. Socialism as a concept, it really appealed to a lot of places around the world that were struggling with inequality and colonialism. They wanted new models for development, something beyond Western capitalism.
Okay, so where do we even begin with non-Western socialism? What are some of the most striking examples?
Well, one of the most important moments was in China. With the revolution led by by Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party, they took those Marxist-Leninist ideas and they kind of adapted them to their own situation. I mean, China was largely agrarian. They had different challenges than Europe.
Right. China in the early 20th century, they had poverty, foreign intervention, all sorts of internal conflicts.
Well, yeah.
So how did Maoism address all of that?
It really changed Chinese society. They collectivized agriculture,
Yeah.
focused on heavy industry, and there was a huge emphasis on ideology and social control. The goal was to modernize China quickly and to become economically independent.
That sounds like a massive undertaking. Did it work? What happened in the long run?
Well, it's a complicated story. Maoism achieved some things. Literacy rates went up. Healthcare access improved. But there were also some terrible consequences. The Great Leap Forward, that was a campaign to industrialize really quickly.
Yeah.
And it led to widespread famine and a lot of economic hardship.
So, progress and tragedy. I guess it shows that even when you have the best intentions, revolution can have consequences that you don't always see coming. Did socialist ideas spread anywhere else in Asia?
Oh, for sure. India, for example, they had their own version of socialism under Jawaharlal Nehru, their first prime minister.
Nehru. He was a key figure in the independence movement.
Yeah.
But how was his vision of socialism different from China's?
He was definitely influenced by socialist ideas, but he knew that India needed something different, a mixed economy, something that combined elements of socialism and capitalism. So he believed in state-led development. The government should build infrastructure and promote welfare. But he also thought that private enterprise was important for economic growth.
It sounds like he was trying to walk a tightrope, trying to get the good from both systems
Yeah.
without the downsides.
Exactly. He wanted growth, but he also wanted to address poverty and inequality. He wanted to build a modern India that was both prosperous and fair.
That's a great goal. What about Africa? How did those socialist ideas play out there, especially after centuries of colonial exploitation?
Well, in Africa, socialism became very connected to Pan-Africanism. It mixed those socialist principles with traditional African values, communalism, solidarity. Leaders like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania and Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, they really pushed for this unique version of socialism.
So what made African socialism different
Yeah.
compared to China or India?
It was really focused on self-reliance and cooperation between all the African nations, and it was about rejecting Western control. They wanted to build a future for Africa that was free from exploitation, a future that was really aligned with their own experiences and their history.
So it was about taking those socialist ideas and making them work for Africa, using their own traditions and values.
Exactly. They wanted a kind of socialism that came from Africa, not just something copied from somewhere else. It was a bold vision, but it faced a lot of challenges from inside and outside.
I can imagine. I mean, trying to build new systems while also dealing with colonialism and the Cold War. That must have been tough.
It was, and a lot of African nations, they struggled to achieve real independence and the social justice they hoped for, but their efforts to find a new way to use both socialist ideas and their own heritage, it's really inspiring.
And speaking of challenges and defying the odds, we can't forget about Cuba. Their revolution, led by Fidel Castro, it shook things up. It challenged the whole global balance of power.
Cuba it's a really interesting case. They had geographic limitations, economic limitations, and constant pressure from the United States, but they managed to find their own way under Castro. They created a socialist system that's lasted for decades.
Cuba has definitely been criticized for human rights, political freedoms. But they've also done some amazing things with healthcare, education, even with uh, even with the embargo from the United States. How did they create a system that's so resilient?
It was a combination of things: strong leadership, a commitment to equality, and yeah, a lot of defiance. They really invested in people, made education and healthcare a right for all citizens.
It's a story that challenges all those ideas about socialism failing. But speaking of stories, the world really changed when the Soviet Union collapsed. How did that affect all the different economic systems?
The fall of the Soviet Union was a huge turning point. The Cold War was over, and it made people who believed in free market capitalism. It made them a lot bolder. It led to the rise of neoliberalism, this ideology that pushes for privatization, deregulation, free trade, and a smaller role for government.
Neoliberalism, we hear that word a lot these days, but I don't always know what it really means. How did it affect countries in the real world?
It meant a move away from state-led development and a move toward market-based solutions. Institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, they really pushed for it, and they often attached conditions to loans and aid. So countries, especially in the global South, they were encouraged to adopt policies that prioritized free markets and limited government.
So it was a shift away from those earlier ideas of creating more equal systems, like the socialist experiments we've been talking about.
Yeah, in many ways, structural adjustment programs, they were often part of those loan conditions. They led to cuts in social spending, privatization of state-owned businesses, and more focus on exports. These policies had mixed results, but often they made inequality worse, and they sometimes hurt local economies.
It sounds like the pendulum swung back to a market-focused approach, and
Yeah.
some of those earlier ideas about social justice and equality, they were kind of left behind. But is that the end of the story? Are those socialist ideas gone?
No, not at all. Neoliberalism was the dominant force for a long time, but we're seeing a comeback for socialist ideas. People are they're worried about inequality,
Wow.
climate change, and the problems with unchecked capitalism. Look at Latin America. They have left-leaning governments. Democratic socialism is it's becoming more popular in Europe and North America. People are they're looking for new economic models, models that focus on sustainability and social justice.
So it's not just a straight line. It's more like a back and forth between different ways of organizing society and managing the economy. It's really interesting to see how all this history is still shaping our world.
It is, and it shows how important it is to understand history, not just as dates and facts, but as a process that affects our present and shapes our future.
This has been amazing. We've traveled through time across the world, explored so many systems of governance, from those early societies to empires rising and falling, the innovations of the Islamic Golden Age, the unique systems in India and China, the socialist experiments of the 20th century, and the rise of and maybe the decline of neoliberalism. We've seen how humans have always tried to figure out how to organize themselves, manage resources, create a world that's just and prosperous.
It's been a real deep dive into human history, and it leaves us with a really important question as we face all these challenges in the 21st century. Climate change, inequality, all the changes from technology. What can we learn from all these examples? What new models might we come up with? What kind of world do we want to build, and what systems will really help us in the years to come?
Those are questions worth thinking about. And as we wrap up our deep dive, I encourage all of you to keep exploring these ideas, keep asking questions. The history of governance and economics is not just some old thing from the past. It's a living story,
Yeah.
and it's still unfolding. By understanding the past, we can prepare ourselves to build a better future, a future that's more just and sustainable and fair for everyone. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey.